All right, please be seated. We thought about this topic a few weeks ago, actually. One of our sister churches, Sunset Bible, presented the material, and the Kings and the Wisdoms were there for the first night at least, and we had an opportunity to thought, man, we need to have something like this at our church. So we commandeered our speakers who both led that conference at Sunset, and there is some biography on the table if you want to know a little bit more about them. I'm not going to give you a long introduction about the speakers. First, going to give you an idea what's going to happen. We're going to have Daniel first, and he's going to give about a 20-minute presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A of which we'd invite you to ask questions. He'd like this to be an interactive thing. We have some questions that were turned in, so if there's a lull in the action, so to speak, Diane will ask a few questions. And then we're going to have a break, roughly around 7 o'clock for 10 minutes. You can stretch. The bathrooms, the men's room is over on this side, and the women's is on the far end of near the door that you came in on the building. And then Richard will speak, give us a presentation, and then another Q&A after that. So if the first question I should have asked that, well, maybe you can bring it up on the second round. So that's kind of what we're doing. We're planning to be done around 8 o'clock. So that's our game plan. These two men are licensed professionals in the counseling profession. They love Christ. They love to see the church equipped as they participate in these at their own church once every year. And we were at one last year on anger. It was great. So they love to do this kind of work. I know Richard personally, as he was my own counselor for a couple of years. I was resisting some painful self-awareness, I could say, and he helped me with that. And so, and also Diane and I saw him as well. Daniel is married to his wife, Jenny, and Richard's wife, Eileen, is with him tonight. They are expecting in July with their first. Daniel, however, is a little bit ahead. He's got 4 kids, and Jenny is home with them tonight. So I would like you to give a warm welcome for Daniel as he comes forward. Thank you.
You gave me a promotion. I have 3 kids, but I can only imagine 4. I can only imagine. Well, I'm grateful to be here with you. I'm going to try to navigate a couple notes, which, knowing myself, I shouldn't have given myself a PowerPoint and notes to go off of, because that's just going to make me more anxious. But I figured I'd model what I'm talking about today, anxiety. So it looks like it's up there. Great. It's funny, in our last presentation, me and Richard had a back and forth about anxiety because microphones was part of our anxiety. And last time, he had the unfortunate circumstance of having the mic not work and not being able to get it on. And so we got to have some back and forth playfully about anxiety and speaking and how the mic didn't work, and I didn't have to deal with that. Well, I had to deal with the not knowing how to get to the place I was speaking at. So I stopped at a couple different places and finally made my way here, thought the door was locked, and got me good and anxious for the presentation on anxiety. So you get to see that from me a little bit today. Well, my name is Daniel Pratt. I am a psychologist. I practice out of Tacoma, live out of Tacoma. My wife and my 3 kids and I go to Sunset Bible Church, and we've had I would say the blessing of being able to teach there, and that's what's kind of led us to be here is just through volunteering at the church. Now we get to do it at another church in the area, so I'm really excited about that, and I'm eager to share some things with you. You'll notice that I did this because this is honestly to comfort me, because I'm so used to back and forth dialogue. That's my element. I like to see what somebody thinks before I respond, but I now have to present to you before I know what you think, and that is going to be a little tricky for me, but I trust that we'll do some good stuff. So you can go to the next slide. I'll wait for that to pop up. So my first few comments, I tried to keep these basic and bare minimum. I have some more notes if anybody's interested in them, but fear is multifaceted. And what I mean by that is that how we define and think about fear informs how we counsel other people, how we counsel ourselves. And there's a few areas in Western culture, at least, that we use to organize how we think about fear. It's not the exclusive ways to think about it, but there's a few things we like to look at in my field. The biology, so what's happening in your body. The psychology, what's in your thought life? What are your behaviors? How do they either make fear worse? How do they make fear lessen over time? When do you develop an anxiety problem? How does it get there? This is where I spend the most time with people, is thinking about their thoughts and their behaviors. There's sociology. How are systems organized? How's a church organized? How is a government organized? How are societies organized to either fuel what you're experiencing or to lessen it? And then spirituality. How do we think of ourselves as embodied spirits? Or what goes beyond what happens in our body or in our minds, and how does that interact with how we experience fear? Is it just our body, our thoughts, and our culture, or is there something more going on there? Well, obviously, in this setting, we like to think about and talk about our spirituality. I'm using spirituality in the broadest sense of the term. So biology, some people like to limit how they think about anxiety or fear from the biological perspective. So this is, there's different structures in your brain, different neurotransmitters. There's more activity happening in one part of the brain versus the other. And while this is important, so these are things like medicine or brain stimulation or exercise or nutrition. These are important things when we think about fear, but is that all that matters, right? Are we just kind of a sack of, chemicals and a brain? Is that all that really matters? I don't believe so, but it is important to think about how what's happening in our body influences how we experience fear. Psychology, so what are we doing when we approach things or when we avoid things? What we're thinking, does that influence our fear? 10 different people see one thing. Somebody gets stuck in traffic. Somebody might get afraid. Somebody might get angry, right? Somebody sees an animal or a dog. Have you guys ever had this, right? A dog starts barking or starts walking up. One person approaches and wants to hug that dog, and the other person runs away, right? What's that about? Sociology is how we fix the world's problems, just reorganizing the government, electing a new official. Some people believe this, right? There's a lot of hope that some people put into their governments or into their structures. Is that gonna make fear go away if we're all on an equal playing field? And then spirituality. What does God have to say about this? Is there anything inspired that can speak to our hearts and our fears, our deepest fears, the ones that we don't want to admit to people, our thoughts about existence in the afterlife? How does that inform how we think about fear? Well, this quote I put up here for you is, I emphasized and bolded, I don't know if you can see it, but I bolded view, think, and counsel. And the way I tie those together is I think how we view fear informs how we think about fear and how we counsel others about their fear. Now, in a church, we like to emphasize counseling others because we like to be other-oriented, right? In the Bible, we're encouraged to love God above all and then to love others as ourselves. It's assumed that we're going to love ourselves, and we're to love others. But we also counsel ourselves when it comes to fear, right? And so how we might counsel somebody else, we may not counsel ourselves. As a helper in the helping profession, this is very common, right? We can give good advice to somebody else, but not take it ourselves. Anybody can relate to that, right? So I often tell people to pay attention to how they counsel other people and then ask themselves, are they taking their own advice? Because sometimes we're great counselors of others, but then we don't apply it to ourselves. So how you think about fear is going to inform what you say. Are you just going to send somebody to take a medicine or to sleep more or to exercise more? Are you going to have them talk to somebody? Are you going to have them journal? Are you going to have them pray, read the Bible? Are you going to have them change churches? Are you going to have them change relationships? A lot of these things happen, but they come from our worldview. And that's the thing I wanted to emphasize, is is not necessarily that one of these is better than the other, but how you think about fear informs what you would do about your fear. So have you ever had to, this is just a pause for thinking. I would usually have a back and forth, but have you ever had to give somebody counsel about their fears? If there's any parents here, I would imagine yes. Even as early as going to sleep, right? How do you sleep without me in the room? That's an early one, right? Or how do I separate from you? Have you ever had to give yourself counsel? Has anybody had a long sleepless night where they couldn't get their mind to stop racing? What did you say to yourself in those moments? What did you do? What might you say if that came up now? If somebody came to you terrified, I don't know what's going to happen. What do I do? Where do you start with that person? You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So again, fear is a multifaceted thing. I give you 3 other categories to use to think about fear. And this is getting into my realm, clinical psychology. We're experts at talking and thinking about what goes wrong. Sometimes we're not very good about what works and what goes right. But I like to think of symptoms, syndromes, and spiritual warfare. And so symptoms is like, what do you notice on the surface, right? Have you ever had a time when you couldn't speak, when you couldn't do something that you should be able to do, something was holding you back? Realistically, you could think logically, it's not that big of a deal, but I just can't do it. I can't face it. Every time I get to go do that thing, I want to pull away. Syndromes is more like disorders, and I use syndrome not because that's the current term, but it's alliteration with S. So we would say disorders. Has anxiety ever caused problems in multiple areas of your life? Has it ever gone across settings? Has it ever been something that's grown from one area to the next? How long does it last? I'll get a little bit more into this in my next slide. And then spiritual warfare. Have you ever questioned your relationship with God, your faith, because of fear? Has it ever caused you to feel like you were abandoned by God? Has it ever made you wonder, where are you, God? Have you ever considered anxiety or fear as spiritual warfare? I jokingly to myself said to God, okay, I thought I was going to be ready for this because I had done it before. But I didn't. I got lost. I didn't know where I was going. I was like, okay, I can feel it. I'm feeling it now. So maybe that was God. Maybe that was somebody else who wanted to attack. You can go to, well, actually, let me go to this one because I have a couple thoughts on it. So when you think of fear, what comes to your mind first? And this question is to kind of get you, I'm just going to pause for a second here with you. What comes to your mind first when you think of fear? Maybe even before you came here today, when you knew that the topic was going to be on fear, what came to your mind? Maybe there was a particular situation. Maybe there's a particular idea. You wanted to hear something. Maybe you didn't want to hear something. What do you think of when you think of fear? Now I want you to think about when you're thinking of fear, how does it similar or different when you're thinking about somebody else's fear, right? Like, get over it already kind of thing, or, that shouldn't be so hard for you. And then how is it similar or different when you think of your fear? Usually, right? Well, it's different, right? It's different when it happens to me. Why am I so afraid of being late to this presentation? Is that going to reflect on me? Probably. So we sometimes think of other people's fears as irrational, silly, but then when it comes to our fears, we're ready to justify them, right, and defend them. So I just want you to pause and think about that, because that's going to inform how you counsel other people. I personally have struggled with anxiety, and it has helped me help others with theirs. It's made me much more patient, much more inclined to listen, and to sit with them in it and not rush right to, these are the things you need to do, and you need to do it in this period of time. I find myself much more patient when I'm aware of and sit with my own fears. You can go ahead and go to the next slide now. So, is my fear a problem? So I wanted to give you a little bit of guidance on this idea of fear is a problem. That's the title, When Fear Becomes a Problem. So I wanted to give you a little bit of guidance as to how to think about that as to maybe whether or not you would benefit from talking to somebody or if there's something you want to do that's targeted at your fear. And there's 4 main categories that I like to think of when I'm thinking of somebody's fear. Somebody comes into my office, I'm sitting with them. It's not always a clinical diagnosis or problem. Sometimes there's reasonable fears that people have. But oftentimes people have tried a lot of things before they come to me. So usually I do end up diagnosing something and treating something. But there's some categories. How distressing is it? Does it distress you in daily life? And if so, how much? How impairing is it? Does it interfere with your functioning? Are you not able to do things you were once able to do, or not able to do things that you're capable of doing, but it's really hard to follow through with effectively? Maybe you're able to do it in one setting versus the next. I remember this distinctly in high school. I played basketball. I was really good in practice and in pickup games. But when the game time came, oh man, I was not as good. It was so much harder for me. And I didn't have a word for it then, but it was anxiety. I had performance anxiety. I was scared of how people would see me. I was scared of missing, which doesn't help you not miss, right? And my best games were when I was sick. I had a cold, right? Because I just didn't, I was like, okay, I'm just going to go out there and do my best. And I did well. I wish I had a sports psychologist talk to me, because who knows how far I would have went. Well, I'm a psychologist, so it's probably better. I'm helping more people than if I was an NBA player, like I wanted to be. I was shooting, free throws or three-pointers in my driveway, and every car that would go by was an NBA scout. So when you think of your fear, are you struggling with something that is best described as possible, or is it something that's probable? Possible or probable? This is really helpful with worries, right? Because sometimes we get stuck in this cycle of worrying about something. And so, for example, I listened to this podcast on the nuclear, kind of the Cold War and nuclear warfare. And I remember being distinctly more anxious afterwards, thinking about the possibility of a nuclear bomb. Now, you guys are all going to do it too, and you're going to email me like, why did you bring up nuclear bombs in your presentation? I can't get over that now. Well, it's a possible, right? It's a high impact, possible thing. But is it probable? Big difference, right? A probable fear. I joked in our other conference about driving. Like, it's possible you could get in a car wreck, but is it probable? Some of you would say yes, right? And we joked like, okay, so are you drinking and driving? Okay, it's probable. Or how many accidents have you got in the past, 2 weeks? Well, 10. Okay, it is probable. But most people are good drivers. You got here today without an accident, right? So it's possible you get in a car accident, but is it probable? This might be a helpful way to think about your fear. But if you're constantly getting stuck on things, or if you have one particular fear that you get stuck on about a possible fear, it's possible I could get this thing and it's paralyzing you. It's possible that's a problem as well. So I want to give you some thoughts and reflections on freedom toward fear, or getting freedom from your fear. So you can go to the next slide. I don't want to just leave you with thinking of fear as a problem and just stop there. And so I kind of broke it down. I packed a lot of information into this one slide. And there's the 3 things on the left that I'll start with, and then I talk about the cycle of anxiety. If you can understand the cycle of anxiety, you, in my opinion, have problematic fear figured out. So I put the term of approach versus avoidance. Now, when you're afraid of something and you avoid it, what happens? You can shout something out if you like. It gets bigger, right? What happens immediately? It goes away. You got it. That is the cycle of avoidance in a nutshell, is that we learn to avoid things because we like immediate gratification, right? I like to joke that we are avoidance experts. We will find all kinds of ways to avoid the things that make us uncomfortable and afraid. And what we forget is how to approach things that we're afraid of. This is where a good counselor, a good parent, or a good friend will encourage you to face your fears little by little if they're not things that are realistically going to harm you. And so we want to learn to approach things that we're nervous about or afraid of so that over time we get less and less anxious about it. High school public speaking was terrifying for me. And I had to approach it over and over again before it started to feel comfortable. So classes helped me do that. Opportunities to teach helped me do that, where it was a volunteer versus, more of a professional thing. And so you don't have to do it all at once. It's not like jumping into the deep end. But gradually over time, you want to start to approach those things so that you can unlearn the fear. And then there's a short versus a long-term perspective. This kind of comes to what I just said, or what you guys just said too, is that when you avoid something, you get that short-term relief, but long-term it gets bigger, right? You reinforce, you strengthen that fear because you're teaching your brain and your body that avoiding the thing is a good thing, right? You might have rationalizations, excuses why it's a good thing to avoid that thing, or it's acceptable in this circumstance, but what you're teaching yourself is you're making your body more afraid of that thing. Does that make sense? And so that over time, that fear grows, or it stays the same. And so I want you to think about change at these levels. So we talked about thinking, behavior, body, and spirit at the beginning. And so I just wanted to help you think through some different ways that you could approach your fears gradually. I think the Bible has great encouragement for us. Fear is mentioned often, and it's not always bad. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and the fool despises instruction. So fear itself is not always a bad thing. Fear rightly placed is good. And so we want to reframe how we think about fear as all bad or all good, or acceptable as unacceptable. The Bible really is like, I've heard it several times, it's the x-ray of ourselves, right? Of our hearts. And so we can go to the Bible, we can go to wise counsel, we can go to each other, we can go to self-reflection and prayer, and we can start shifting our thinking. There's a lot of words of comfort and challenge in the Bible, and I would encourage you to just do a word study or just go to Scripture and say, what do you have to say to me about fear? Is there anything here? Look at Proverbs and see what it says about fear. Let it flavor how you think about your fear. And if you're the only one who knows about your fear, that's going to make it hard to move past that fear, right? And so this is where I would encourage you towards behavior. Simply talking about your fear is exposing yourself to your fear, right? You're going to begin to unlearn your fear just by putting words to it with another person. Maybe even just putting words to it to yourself, right? Admitting to yourself that, yeah, I got a problem. This is not going well. God, help me. That's a great place to start. And then maybe you tell it to somebody else that you trust. I have this problem with fear. I don't want to do anything about it yet. I just want to tell you. And that's okay. And hopefully you have somebody in your life that would help you do that. Body. This is where I would encourage you to think about. So if anybody has had a panic attack, it is not very amenable to reason at that point, right? What are you scared of? That makes it worse, right? Now you're shaming me for having a panic attack. At the point when you've experienced a certain level of flooding fear, it's going to run its course. But if you can label it as, okay, this is panic, and breathe. There's a breathing technique that I found really helpful for me. It might not be helpful for you, but it's called 4-7-8. 4 seconds in, 7-second hold, 8 seconds out. You do that 3 or 4 times. Maybe some of you will do that here, and you'll probably get close to falling asleep. That's okay. It's late. You just had a snack. If somebody falls asleep, please catch them. We don't want anybody to have a head injury. But 4-7-8, in, you want to hold it and slowly exhale. Because ironically, when you're anxious, that short breath, you have too much carbon dioxide. I know we say you need to get more air, right? It's actually not getting more oxygen. It's actually getting more carbon dioxide in our body, oddly enough. And so you take that deep breath in, you hold it for longer, and you exhale even longer. Try that tonight if you don't want to do it here and fall asleep. Try that tonight and see what happens. Do a couple deep breaths like that, and you'll be surprised at how that can begin to shift your body. And then you can start thinking differently as part of that, and you can start approaching your fears as part of that. One of the ways that I encourage people, we do what's called Suds Scaling in my profession. So subjective units of distress. It's really complicated. You rate from 0 to 10 how scared you are, right? And then if you're at a 10, you don't have to approach, right? Maybe it's about a 7 or 8. You stay there or you step back. But if you're at like a 5 or a 6, okay, I think you can handle that. Just stay there. Just stay with it longer. The goal is to try to avoid avoidance. And then you're going to gradually, over time, unlearn that fear. Because your body only has so much adrenaline to pump into your system. And then spirit, prayer, fellowship, Bible reading. What does God think about my fear? What does he think of me? And I think that we have incredible comfort as Christians, knowing that we don't have to earn favor with God. Christ has done it for us. And so there's so many things in this world that we can get wrapped up in that cause us fear that are probably out of proportion. And if you want to think deeply about that, let me know, and I'd be glad to talk to you about it. And so this cycle here is just a summary of what we just talked about. So you have something anxious happen, some kind of anxiety, something scares you, and then the distress, you got to resolve the distress, so you want to avoid it. Over the short term, it goes away, so it kind of strengthens that, okay, it worked. But then in the long term, if you're not paying attention, it just grows and grows and grows. And what you do is you just reverse that cycle over time. When you have the anxiety, you insert approach, which increases your short-term anxiety, but over the long term, it goes down, right? So if your anxiety goes up when you're approaching it, I tell people this, that's actually a good thing. It says that we're going in the right direction, right? And many of you, or many of us as people, need somebody who's patient to walk through that with us. So it's okay to ask for help, because if it hasn't reversed itself yet, it might take a little bit of help to get there. So that's all I have, and I'm eager to hear you guys' questions and love to dialogue with you more. Okay.
Just kind of relax.
Gotta take this one. Perfect.
Keep your mic, yeah.
Okay. There we go.
So this is your chance to talk to a trained professional about a topic that is really something that a lot of us deal with. So I'm going to kind of moderate questions. I've got some that were given in advance, but if anybody would like to ask, we are welcoming that. They love to take, what would you say to a person who, you don't need to be asking for yourself. They love those kinds of questions. And we are actually recording this so that we can post it on the church website for people who weren't able to be here. So we're going to get a mic to you if you have a question for the sake of the recording. So who wants to start? Okay, while Troy's getting a mic to Scott, I'm going to ask the first question. Is anxiety a sin? Is it always a sin? And is it ever a sin?
Well, I think this is on. Okay, first of all, I think you did an amazing job, Daniel.
Oh, thank you.
Well done. Yeah. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like you've done the heavy lifting, and I could just come in and
Perfect.
put a bow on it.
There you go.
So, good question, Dan. You couldn't really give a short answer to that, right? But I'll do my best. So, my name's Richard. It's good to be here. I think anxiety, when we think of fear, usually fear is attached to an object. So, I'm afraid of fill in the blank. With anxiety, you can take a general type of fear and you can extend it out over a longer time period where you're not actually facing the object of fear at that moment, right? But there's a lingering effect of either anticipating the fear or remembering the fear. So if you think about it, it's like a diffused effect of fear that's stretched over time. And so I think there's elements of that that are just natural, that we do we have logical minds, and so we do anticipate danger, right? Which leads to anxiety. It's hard to just not do that. You think about what is dangerous and what might happen. All of us do that, and so that could lead to anxiety. I think that's natural, not necessarily sinful. Now, where it could become sinful, potentially, is when you sort of your own will, embrace that anticipation of what might happen, the hypothetical, the potential, and you sort of make that sacred in the sense that you embrace it, you adopt it, you believe it, you almost prophetically trust that it's true, to the sense that you are responding only to that and nothing else. So I think that's a subtle move there, but it can happen. And I think when Jesus tells us not to worry, that's what he's talking about, to deliberately, intentionally focus on our anxiety in a way that we're making it what is true to us most fundamentally.
Yeah, really good answer. I want to add to that, just in ways that we found helpful studying emotions from a biblical counseling perspective. One of the things that the Bible does so well is it reveals how, so the question would be maybe better asked is does anxiety ever reveal sin? Because I think anxiety is more easily thought of as a symptom of something else. Like you were saying, of an object that we're afraid of, or of an experience that's usually just happening and we're not really sure why it is. But is the anxiety we're experiencing revealing some other thing that we've made too important, or something that we've put above God in importance? One of the biblical terms of fear of man is one that comes up often, right? Like, are we putting people and power, profit, or pleasure above God in our lives? And in that way, our anxiety might be an indicator, like a check engine light, of some other problem that's lurking under the surface, right? The check engine light isn't necessarily the most important thing. It's what it points to. And so I think anxiety can be one of those things you can pay attention to and say, where is this coming from? And I think it's a good question, is this revealing some area of my life that is sinful? Is there something that I need to confess or examine deeper to see, where am I putting my trust in this life? Am I putting it in my bank account? Am I putting it in my boss? Am I putting it in my spouse? Is that where all my hope resides? Or is my hope ultimately in the Lord? There it
It's
is.
on. It wasn't turned on. The mic was not turned on. Okay, I like what you were saying at the end about the kind of the numbering, putting a number to your level of symptoms. Sometimes you are at a 10, but because you have a responsibility, you have to approach, which of course then takes your amp up to 11. So what advice or what thoughts do you have for somebody who is already at a 10
Yeah.
and really has to try to find a way to approach?
Yeah, the immediate thing that came to my mind was call for backup. Like a police officer, you've seen those shows, right, where there's like the maverick police officer who's there and there's a crime in progress and they say, wait for backup, and they just rush in and something terrible happens. I think that it's good to be aware that if our anxiety is at a 10, our reasoning skills and our discernment is going to be lessened. So it would be a good idea to try to slow down, and even if you have to approach, to do it thoughtfully and slowly, and maybe call for backup. Maybe there's somebody to go with you, or there's like I'm thinking of parenting, right? If I'm feeling terrible dread, now there might be a situation like one of my kids is running down into the road. Well, yeah, I got to approach in that situation. But if it's one of my kids is getting in a fight with another kid, I might actually want to call for backup, because I might be prone to anger or an angry response in that situation, where it's like, hey, can you come with me? I need somebody to hold me accountable so I don't overreact in this situation. So having eyes on you in those kind of situations can be wise, or support, or thinking of that even can help, right? Like, okay, I know I have my pastor, or I know I have my spouse, or I know I have a partner or a friend, somebody who I can talk to about this after I do it. That's a good, if there's any specific examples you wanted to give, that would be helpful to me, but that's just my initial thought. And I don't know if, Richard, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, just one quick thing to add, and that was a great answer. Just that when I think of if there's a need to respond, right, if that situation requires a response, then part of God's grace is that he's given us this jolt of adrenaline that will kick in and give us a boost in that time. So if there's a need, I think that is what rushes in, and it's not a logical, thought-out process, but it's just a surge of strength, a surge of energy, and that can help in that moment of need. And so hopefully if it is a crisis where there is a need for response, that I think that's part of how God made us, and it's a grace.
Could you go over panic attack again?
Yeah. So I'll say a little bit more about panic attacks. So panic attacks are surges of anxiety to where reasoning essentially goes out the window, right? We're usually having catastrophic thoughts that something terrible is going to happen or is happening. Oftentimes people misinterpret it as a heart attack and will go to the hospital, but there's a lot of those same symptoms, like you have a pounding heart, you have muscle tension, you might have narrowing of vision. This is not to say that if you have these symptoms, don't go to the hospital, but if you've had panic attacks before, most likely it is another one because they tend to reoccur because you get hypersensitized to them. But in the moment of a panic attack, the things that I would encourage are those deep breaths. So like that 4-7-8 breathing. I like to have a structure, right? And I would encourage people who have had panic attacks or have them or know somebody who does to practice it beforehand, because in the moment you're not going to think of it. And it needs to be a well-practiced skill before it happens if you're going to call upon it. You can also call upon scripture verses that are comforting. Like for me, Psalm 23 is incredibly helpful. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. Like I have everything I need. I have everything I need, right? Just reminding myself that I have everything I need. And breathing. And again, you can call for backup. Oftentimes people have support people who are supportive that would just sit with them through that. To not be alone in those moments can sometimes help. Just having somebody there to be with you, hold your hand, elbow bump these days, something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. For 8 seconds, yep. So 4 seconds in, 7-second hold, 8 seconds out. If I do that 3 or 4 times, there'd probably be people that are ready to fall asleep. And it really helps. It helps your body slow down.
Yeah, and I like how you make that O with your mouth. It really helps you slow down your exhale, that kind of, because we tend to exhale quickly, and just making your mouth into that shape can help. And the only other thing I'll say about panic attacks in my clinical experience, is maybe this is obvious, but a panic attack usually happens outside of the moment of actual danger. Mm-hmm. And so there's not an actual crisis happening at the moment. It's more of it's connected to a memory or a fear. And so they can happen at random times when they're not expected. Mm-hmm. Right? It can come out of nowhere. And so what's needed is to calm down the body. It's not to respond to an immediate crisis.
So if you're trying to help somebody that's in a panic attack, first thing would be is to empathize with them, right?
Yes.
And then
Yeah, absolutely.
maybe if you tell them things like you're safe right now,
Mm-hmm.
and those kind of things, to try to get them to think logically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have some tricks for that, or
You're right on the right track.
because you want them to think logically, or to trust God, or you could tell them, you could say you want to pray with them, or just something to get them to not think about whatever they're afraid of, so they have time to calm their mind down.
Yeah, how I would prioritize it is focusing on the body, like Richard said. So, like you said, I'm here with you. I'm going to stay with you until you feel better. And if they're saying I have to go to the hospital and it's a panic attack, I mean, you could always say, okay, we can do that, but let's take a few deep breaths, and why don't we pack things up first, and I'm here with you. We'll get you to where you need to go, and you can be reassuring. You can be present. I'm going to stay with you. I'm not going anywhere. And just remind them of your presence, and I would model the breathing and the slow tone of voice, right? So I would be paying attention to my body, paying attention to their body, and see if it starts getting better as I'm talking. You can just listen to me talk, we're going to get through this. I'll get through this with you.
And if you know the person, you could bug them and just
Oh, yeah.
let them calm down.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you give it to Larry?
I'm quite involved with the recovery community, and usually when we go to steps 4 to 9, 4 is this moral, spiritual, financial inventory, and then 9 is when you're actually doing amends. I see it over and over with my sponsees. If anyone doesn't understand, I know you guys will, so I'm not going to explain what all that means, but I see this huge fear.
Yeah.
All the people I've harmed, all the losses I've created, all the havoc I've made, to get recovery, trusting God, you know what I mean, and all that, and then all of a sudden this wall at step 9, where you make amends, and sometimes someone says, you know what, you can go to the hot place. That happens, I'm trying to make amends, and there's like, I do what the Bible said, and they don't want to go to the hot place, or worse,
Yeah.
And so what's your advice to sponsors and people like that? They're just kind of like, you're walking beside, not your mother, but I'm here, and I've done this, and I know I just see it over and over again, and then they just back away from doing the work.
Really good. Yeah. Did you want to say?
Yeah, that would be an understandable fear, right? Because they're facing up to what the fallout of their behavior has been. And there might not be a positive response to that. You couldn't guarantee that. But the idea would be you're doing what is right, regardless of the response. And so try to make peace with what you're doing, you don't need the proper response to have peace. So I mean, it would take some moral strength to do that. I think it would take courage. As a sponsor, you would just want to reassure that this is the right thing to do. This is the good thing to do, regardless of the outcome as far as how the other person responds. Whether or not they receive your apology, whether or not they receive your owning up to, it is still the right thing to do, and make peace with that. At the end of the day, you've made it right as best you can. And so I think that would just be a patience, compassion, reassurance.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, and then maybe this will answer your question, maybe not, but I would want to listen, because like I had said, just talking about your fear is facing it. And so if they were to say something like you said, where, I'm ready to back out, I'm ready to give up, well, what you can think is that, well, they're talking to you about it, right? So they haven't yet backed out of it. And so I would encourage them, tell me more about that. How did you get to that decision? And by doing that, you're kind of bringing it back to their fear, right? And try to focus on their fear and listen. I would want to listen first before I provided any counsel, because they're probably going to think I don't understand just how scary it is unless I've really understood and reflected and showed them that I understand the fear. So I always try to not just nod my head and say or yeah, but actually rephrase it and state it in my own terms, but based on what they're telling me. And then once you get a head nod or absolutely, then you kind of got a shared space, and then you can start talking about, why don't we stay here before we make any decisions? Why don't we sleep on it? Or why don't we meet back and talk about this again? Because right now it sounds like that's really hard. And then see if that next time, if they're in a different place, and if you can start inching them towards it again. And sometimes I will encourage people, would it help if I was like a support person for you, before and after you do that? You can call me. Let me know when you're going to do it. Yeah, that's what you do. Ooh. Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to take a step? Okay. So yeah, shame and guilt, very, very big things, especially with 12 steps. Is that part of it is the fear of how other people are going to see you. So I usually categorize guilt as like I've done something wrong, and shame as I am something wrong, or something like I'm a bad person, right? Versus I did something bad versus I'm a bad person. It encumbers all of who I am. And honestly, I think the best answer to shame is the gospel. But that would be a longer conversation with the person than we could cover here today. But, you've done something wrong versus you are somebody bad. And maybe they don't want to face that and share those things with that person because they're afraid that it's just going to reveal that belief, usually deep-seated, that I'm a broken person. I can't be fixed. And I would hope that they could talk to somebody, and maybe that's you, maybe that's somebody like me, to get that out before they did that, so they could begin to reframe that belief before they get flooded with somebody exposing it to them.
I want to try and get one more question in before we break. When is it appropriate to use medication as a help? And could that be a way to create space for looking at something that might be underlying the cause of the fear or anxiety?
Yeah, I think Daniel probably knows more about this, but I would say medication could be helpful, and it's not a final solution necessarily, but I think it could be a tool that's used to get someone to a place where other techniques would be more beneficial and that they would be more effective.
Yeah, I would just say that sometimes anxiety is so severe that the idea of talking about it or facing it and working on it is just too flooding. I think of people with severe post-traumatic stress disorder or hoarding or obsessive-compulsive disorder, panic disorder, or generalized anxiety. Sometimes the symptoms are just so severe that it's hard to even bring the topic up. And so for somebody like that, it might be worthwhile, and they could come see a counselor first, worthwhile to talk to somebody to see if that's a good option. Sometimes I'll work with people who have some kind of problem where it's clear that it's just too overwhelming what we talk about in the sessions to continue with therapy on once-a-week basis, even twice a week, to where in order for us to do the work of therapy, they need something to help stabilize their mood and their fears. But I don't believe that it's wrong to do such, because I think we're embodied. We have a body, and we live in a broken world, and not everything is as it should be. And so I do believe that that's part of the fallenness of humanity, that we have broken bodies, broken brains. Not completely broken, but there's something wrong that we need some support to face sometimes.
Yeah, I would just echo that too. A lot of the folks that I work with have a hesitation to want to even consider medication, and I do often encourage that this is a supplementary thing that can be really helpful, and there's no shame in that. Just like you wouldn't have shame in a medical procedure or a medical physical supplement to help you physically. It would be similar to that. Okay. And so
I'm going to get one more in. There's been an increase, noticeably, of fear and anxiety in children, and classroom teachers or those who interact with them see this a lot. Do you have any recommendations for the person who is witnessing evidence of fear and anxiety, but they're not the parent?
For children?
For children.
For children, yeah. I work mostly with adults, but what I do know with my own kids and with talking to other parents and what I know about development is that, and Richard actually might be able to answer this working with families more than I do, is that play seems to be kind of a gateway with kids. And so I would see that in my clinical jargon as like a gradually approaching fears, is you can approach it through play, or you could approach it through like playful language, or if you have anything that you connect with that child on, if you're working directly with the child, that you can be kind of safe and playful with them and not make it, you have this fear and we need to face it. That's not going to work with a kid. I actually have a story that if we have time at the end, I'll tell it about my son who got basically a phobia at a theme park. I tried to help him work through it with approach, and it didn't work well. But play works much better with kids from my experience. And so if you can get any kind of play therapy, or you can learn how to do kind of child-directed play where they feel like they're the one in charge, then that can sometimes help. In terms of talking to parents about it, I'll let, if Richard wants to piggyback off that.
yeah, I could see it being a challenge for teachers in the classroom setting because they have the whole class to consider. But yeah, I did a couple years of therapy almost exclusively with kids. And it really is getting on the level of the child and not talking down towards them and really just meeting them where they are. And it is in a playful, lighthearted sense that you connect with a child. And through that, there's a safety that they experience. And I think just toys, laughter, games are a way into a child's experience. And through that, I think there's a diminishing of fear that happens. And it's usually not directly that you address a fear in a child, but I find that once you've opened up that playful kind of dynamic, that they will, of their own free will, they'll talk about their fear and how they can overcome it. So you can suggest things, but you don't want to directly sort of challenge a child on their fear. You want to invite them into a safe, if you can, a safe environment. And usually that's a playful environment.
I'm thinking it might be a little harder with a teenager.
Video games, maybe? I don't know. Virtual reality.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah, you bet.
It's pretty intuitive, probably for most of us, to kind of like get the connection between fear and anxiety. Is there a relationship, per se, with grief? And if there's not a direct relationship with grief, what about a situation where there's sort of you're anticipating grief, which is, I guess that's just fear, right? But something you're afraid of. But or maybe like progressive. Okay, I'll just. I think this is still this. I'll give you a little bit more detail. I think it'll still be generic for a lot of people might benefit from it. So somebody is participating in extremely self-destructive behavior. Somebody that you care about, somebody that you love, and it's likely that it will end in that person's death. I think you kind of start grieving ahead of time. So maybe you can kind of help us understand that a little bit. If you don't have time now, we can do that for break too. That's up to the moderator. But that's my question.
The word that came to my mind is the feeling of powerlessness in a situation like that.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and how hard it is to sit with that and to be present with it. And so, yeah, I think you're wise to say that it's like you're grieving ahead of time. If nothing else, the loss of connectedness, of feeling powerless to influence this person who is down a destructive path that doesn't show any signs of improving. And that's a really scary thought. And it's particularly complicated because it's like grieving somebody who's not gone, right? It's like, how do you grieve somebody who's still here but not fully here? And I think of particularly, this may be the situation, but substance abuse, addiction, where you're trying to reach into the heart of somebody who's far gone in that path, and how do you bring them back, or some other path that can be self-destructive. I think that the fear of death definitely could be a part of that, and how do you face that?
Yeah, and sometimes in the field we call that ambiguous loss, because it's loss that's not clearly defined by an event. And so it's extended over time, and it's not, you don't really know how it will develop and how it will end. And sometimes you don't even know what's happening, but you can imagine what might happen. And so fear kind of extends the grief, right? As opposed to losing someone, that sort of starts a grieving process from there. But fear kind of extends that from even starting, right? And you're caught in this difficult situation of not knowing how to grieve. And so I don't really have an answer for that, but just to say that is a very difficult, and it's hard to let go when there's nothing to let go of yet, other than just a painful possibility.
I will just add quickly, because it connected on a level for me, that in those situations, I try to hold nothing back. So if I have an interaction with a person like that, I often have people who I don't know if they're going to make it back to their next session. And so I lean in as much as I can. I try not to leave anything unsaid. There's a certain amount of fearlessness that comes over me in those moments when it's like, you think about, this person could not be here next time, so I'm going to say everything that I think needs to be said in this situation if I can speak to their heart.
Yeah, and that just brought another thought for me too. That's great. I think that's a real opportunity to draw near to God in a way that you otherwise might not, because there's a real dependence on God in a situation like that. There's a helplessness, there is a fear, and there's a pain that really brings you to the threshold of the throne of God, where you see your need for him and a reliance upon him that is desperate, and that can be a breakthrough to a closeness with God. Thank you, guys.
We are going to take a break until 7:15. So I would encourage you to dig around in those snack boxes on your tables. There are some treasures in there. And we'll hear from Richard when we resume.
It says it's on. There we go. If you could sit down, we'll give Richard an opportunity to address us with his topic, which is on the screen there behind me.
Is that okay? All right. I think we're good. All right. Sorry. It's good to be among God's people this beautiful day. I feel like I'm among friends. Can I get some reassurance? Am I among friends? Okay, thanks. I feel better. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like Daniel did excellent, and I feel like he gave you the real meat of practical wisdom, and now I can come in and give you a nice dessert. I have to actually apologize because, Daniel had some trouble finding the place, and I told him, let me know if you have trouble finding the place, and he was trying to reach me, and my phone was off, so that's my bad, Daniel. Whenever I make a mistake with my clients, I just tell them it's part of their treatment, but I can't do that. I can't do that this time. Okay. So I hope you learned the lesson. Okay, so I think we have a title up there. So I want to talk to you today about the surprising good news of the fear of the Lord. And how on earth, though, can fear be good news? We've just been talking about how fear can become a problem. And I think usually we think of it that way, don't we? We think of fear as problematic. We think of fear as something to overcome. We think of fear as something to conquer, to avoid. And I have a confession to make. I am someone who knows the gospel of Christ. I know it intellectually. By the grace of God, I've responded to it. And so I've received regeneration. I'm born again. By God's grace, I know the gospel by experience. And I am even a minister of that gospel in the sense that I counsel people who come to me under the umbrella of Christian counseling. And so they're coming to me not just to address the psychological and social issues and physical issues, but also spiritual. And in spite of all of this, I am someone who is often ruled by fear. I'm often overwhelmed and tossed to and fro by the fears of this life. And there are times when I sit with people and I hear about what they're struggling with, and I hear what is causing them distress. I hear about great tragedy, and I hear about suffering. And after listening and carefully taking notes, I'll often ask as part of the interview something like, how does your faith in God influence the way that you navigate or address the situation? And if I look into my own life, it's easier when you're asking the question, but if I had to ask it to myself when I'm struggling, I would have to say often, the answer would be it doesn't. It doesn't influence, or not enough, because though I know the truth and I believe it, what I'm experiencing is somehow not affected. And so God in his patience has been teaching me, and recently been teaching me a lot about what is the antidote to this situation. And so I've been reading this book, and I'm going to lean heavily on this. It's a recent publication called Rejoice and Tremble, and the subtitle, Surprising Good News of the Fear of the Lord. And this is Michael Reeves. And I've been reading this book, and I feel like it's more than reading a book. I feel like the author is he's taken me by the hand and he's led me into the sanctuary of God and averted my eyes and turned my eyes upward and said, look upon the God that you worship and find him anew. And so I'm going to be using his words quite frequently, and that's to your benefit. They're better than my words. I don't feel too bad about that because he often will use others' words. He'll quote Luther, he'll quote Calvin, he'll quote Bunyan, he'll quote Edwards, he'll quote Spurgeon. And I think what I like about that is that Reeves is saying, what's more important than my voice here is the message itself. And so through this, I've been blessed. And so just as an introduction, I wanted to share a short segment from when I was studying international relations. I was studying to become a diplomat. That was didn't pan out, but I read Machiavelli, and he wrote a book called The Prince. And Machiavelli, he's an Italian, and he looked at history. This is in the 14th century. And he looked at history and he said, okay, what can I learn about history about how to be a good ruler? So how to rule over people effectively, right? And so in this book, he asks the question, is it better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved as a leader? I'll read you what he says. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two either must be dispensed with. Because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children when the need is far distant, but when it approaches, they turn against you. And that prince who, relying entirely on their promises, has neglected other precautions, is ruined, because friendships that are obtained by payments and not by greatness or nobility of mind may indeed be earned, but they are not secured, and in the time of need cannot be relied upon. And men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment, which never fails. And so basically, what he's saying there is that it's safer to have people fear you for your cruelty, and that will more powerfully guarantee their loyalty. And to be loved is a dangerous place because people will turn against you. So just keep that in the back of your minds, and we'll come back to this idea of fear and love and how they influence leadership. So in Reeves' book, first thing he points out, which I think is obvious to us, is that fear is a powerful emotion. So he says, we brood and agonize over all the dark and dreadful things that could happen to us. We could lose our lives, health, or loved ones, how we might fail or be rejected. Fear is probably the strongest human emotion, but is one that baffles us. I would also say it's probably the emotion that is most negatively assessed. All the other emotions I can think of, there's some way to view them positively. Even sadness, when you think of grief, is often seen as something that's necessary, something that can be even healing, something that can be good. Anger, we often think, I'm vindicated in my anger, this is necessary, this is right in some sense. Fear is usually seen as a problem. And so when we come to the Bible, the picture seems equally confusing. Is fear a good thing or a bad? And so Reeves takes you through a couple of scriptures where fear is something that God has come in to rescue us from. So fear is clearly presented as a bad thing. And he says, indeed, the most frequent command of Scripture is do not be afraid. And yet, again and again in Scripture, he says we are called to fear. Perhaps even more strangely, we are called to fear God. And he gives a few passages. Of course, some are well known. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. David prays in Psalm 86:11, teach me your ways, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. Job's faithfulness is summed up when he's described as a blameless and upright man who fears the Lord. And even in the New Testament, in the Magnificat, Mary says, as part of her prayer, the Lord's mercy is for those who fear him, generation to generation. And so we're taught this concept of the fear of the Lord in Scripture, and it's held out as a good thing. And yet fear, the same way, the same word is used to describe something we're to overcome and that God rescues us from. Other writers have described the fear of the Lord. John Murray, who is a Puritan preacher, said the fear of God is the soul of godliness, which sounds important to me. Puritan John Owen argued that in Scripture, the fear of the Lord is the whole worship of God and all the obedience which we owe unto him. Martin Luther taught in his small catechism that the fulfillment of the law means we are to fear, love, and trust God above all things. So there you have, fear is essential for godliness, it is necessary for obedience, and it is a critical part of worship. So what we have is this confusion about fear. So on the one hand, I'm reading Reeves here, we are told that Christ frees us from fear. On the other, we are told we ought to fear, and fear God no less. It can leave us discouraged and wishing that the fear of God were not so prominent an idea in Scripture. We have quite enough fears without adding more, thank you very much. And fearing God just feels so negative. It just doesn't seem to square with the God of love and grace we meet in the gospel. Why would any God worth loving want to be feared? It's all made worse by the impression that fear and love are two different languages preferred by two different Christian camps, perhaps two different theologies. The one camp speaks of love and grace and never fearing God, and the other camp seems angered by this and emphasizes how afraid of God we should be. The fear of God is like cold water on the Christian's love for God. We get the impression that the fear of God must be the gloomy theological equivalent of eating your greens. Yuck. Something the theological health nut binges on while everyone else enjoys tastier fare. My aim now, Reeves says, is to cut through this discouraging confusion. I want you to rejoice in this strange paradox that the gospel both frees us from fear and gives us fear. It frees us from our crippling fears, giving us instead a most delightful, happy, and wonderful fear. And he quotes in Isaiah 11, verse 1 to 3, there shall come forth, this is a messianic prophecy, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. Now this is talking about Christ. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. So skipping ahead a little bit, C.S. Lewis wrote the famous book, The Four Loves, and it was helpful because it took this idea of love, this word love, that can describe so many different things, and it broke it into these four Greek words, which describe different kinds of love, different forms of love, so that the word love itself includes so many things. So I think this book could have been called, another title, could have been The Three Fears, because the same word fear can describe different things, and we can be confused by this if we're not careful. So the three kinds of fear that the Bible talks about, and Reeves identifies, one is natural fear, and this is just simply, I'll read what he says. He says, since we live in a fallen world, we live surrounded by danger. But we also fear accidents. He says the greatest of these dangers is death, but we also fear accidents, pain, and enemies. For the fall made the world a place full of fear. That does not mean, though, that our fears of these dangers are in themselves sinful. And the Gospels tell us how, in the face of his impending death, Jesus was greatly distressed and troubled. And you could even say that Jesus experienced fear in Gethsemane. So this is not necessarily sinful. Natural fear is just a natural response to a fallen and broken world affected by sin, especially when you care about people, especially when you care about things. There's a natural fear. But the other two are the most important that we want to talk about tonight. There are two different kinds of fears, of fear of God. So Christian theologians have commonly described two other types of fear. More specifically, they've described two different types of fear of God. And Reeves calls them sinful fear and right fear. So the first type of fear of God, sinful fear, is condemned by Scripture. I'm going to read what he says. I've been tempted to call it wrong fear, but there's a sense in which it is actually quite right for unbelievers to be afraid of God. The holy God is terrible to those who are far from him. Instead, I am calling it sinful fear, since it is a fear of God that flows from sin. And one of the main points I want you to get about this is that sinful fear drives us away from God. So you can recognize it by its effect. If it's a fear that makes you avoid God, if it's a fear that makes you distance yourself from God, if it's a fear that makes you less prayerful, if it's a fear that makes you avoid gathering with God's people, this is sinful fear. He gives examples of this. He quotes Martin Luther, who explained how, under the medieval Roman Catholicism he had grown up with, Christ was depicted as a grim tyrant, a furious and stern judge who demanded much of us and imposed good works as payment for our sins. This makes us reluctant to go to him. If my conscience is stricken with fear, I feel sufficiently repelled. My heart and bad conscience quite naturally shun him who I fear. Fear and terror prod and goad me away from him, so that I do not stay with him. As Luther puts it, I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God. And when I look inside my heart, I see, even in times when I wasn't consciously angry with God, I avoided him out of this view of him, which is not really correct. I viewed him as this stern judge, as this severe, austere figure, towering over me, someone to avoid, someone to cower from, someone to seek my comfort elsewhere, someone to have something else nearby to trust in, something more friendly, something more familiar, something safer. This was a fear that kept me from God. But I want to turn our attention to what Reeves calls the right fear. All I'm able to do tonight is to give you to whet your appetite, to give you a taste. And I would really encourage you to look into this, because as I've started to cultivate this right fear, I'm going to read you some passages in my own heart. I've started to see that this was the missing piece. This is what's been missing from my faith. It may have been there at times, but whenever I used to think of the fear of the Lord, I would think of this kind of, reverence where you sit up straight and make sure that you're, in your best attire and that you look acceptable to God externally. That's how I would think of it. And that, you should bow your head when you pray because it's a sign of respect. Things like this, which was such a small thing. It was not a source of great strength for me. It was not a source of great joy for me. It was not a source of great resilience for me. But let me just introduce the way Reeves describes right fear, and then we'll talk about it more in the Q&A maybe, and if you want to talk about it more, I'll be happy to afterwards. But so Reeves says the right fear of God is quite explicitly a blessing of the new covenant. And he quotes a passage in Jeremiah 33 where the Lord goes on to explain the nature of his new covenant fear in words so striking that they overturn all our expectations. And this is Jeremiah 33, verses 8 to 9. I will cleanse them from all the guilt of their sin against me. I will forgive all the guilt of their sin and rebellion against me. And this city shall be to me a name of joy, a praise and a glory before all the nations of the earth, who shall hear of all the good that I do for them. They shall fear and tremble because of all the good and all the prosperity I provide. Just a few more and I'll close, but there's so much I could read. But so John Bunyan wrote a good short work called A Treatise on the Fear of God, and he's one of the best who describes it. Bunyan says that those who have no faith will have no true fear of God, and those who have a devil's faith will have a devil's fear, and those who have a saint's faith will have a saint's fear. This godly fear, he explained, flows primarily from a sense of the love and kindness of God to the soul, from some sense or hope of mercy from God by Jesus Christ. Indeed, nothing can lay a stronger obligation upon the heart to fear God than a sense of or hope in mercy. This begetteth true tenderness of heart, true godly softness of spirit. This truly endeareth the affections to God. And in this true tenderness, softness, and endearedness of affection to God lieth the very essence of this fear of the Lord. And Charles Spurgeon wrote a great little book on, he says, called A Fear to be Desired. And I think this is another great treatment of the fear of the Lord. Reeves quotes it often. Spurgeon says that this is the sort of fear which has in it the very essence of love, and without which there would be no joy even in the presence of God. The closer we look, the closer fear of God and love of God appear. And Spurgeon says, "It is not because we are afraid of him, but because we delight in him that we fear before him. Thine heart shall fear and shall be enlarged," says the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 60, verse 5. And so it comes to pass with us. The more we fear the Lord, the more we love him, until this becomes to us the true fear of God, to love him with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. So the right fear of God is not the flip side of our love for God. It's actually intermingled with our love. And it really elevates our love to a powerful state. He also talks about how the fear of God is commingled with joy. That this is not a fear that leads to kind of austerity or sadness or gloominess. This is a fear that is blessed by joy. One more thing I wanted to say. Bunyan says that another part of good news here is that the fear of the Lord is something that's available to all of us. Sometimes we can, and I hear people do this, they'll think of what they're able to contribute to God's kingdom, what they're able to do and produce to serve God and his people. And there are people who bring themselves up short because they don't feel like they have enough to offer. They don't feel like they have a significant enough contribution in ministry. But listen to what Bunyan says. God hath not laid the comfort of his people in the doing of external duties, nor the salvation of their souls, but in believing, loving, and fearing God. Neither hath he laid these things in actions done in their health, nor in the due management of their most excellent parts, but in the receiving of Christ and fear of God, the which, good Christian, thou mayest do, and do acceptably, even though thou shouldst lie bedrid all thy days. Thou mayest also be sick and believe, be sick and love, be sick and fear God, and so be a blessed man. And here the poor Christian hath something to answer them that reproach him for his ignoble pedigree and shortness of the glory of the wisdom of the world. True, may that man say, I was taken out of the dunghill, I was born in a base and low estate, but I fear God. I have no worldly greatness, nor excellency of natural parts, but I fear God. The Lord looks on the heart and is pleased when he finds it quaking in wonder, love, and praise. But that should concern all people who place their stock in their outward usefulness, rather than the inner state of their hearts. Yet all should be encouraged, for the nature of the living God means that the fear which pleases him is not a groveling, shrinking fear. He is no tyrant. It is an ecstasy of love and joy that senses how overwhelmingly kind and magnificent, good and true God is, that therefore leans on him in staggered praise and faith. So when I think about my own heart and how it shrinks back in fear, even though I know the truth and I know God in a sense, I think what's missing is this beautiful, glorious trembling and rejoicing, this beautiful fear of God. And Spurgeon actually says, this fear of God is like a roaring lion that drives away other fears. That in the radiance of this fear, other fears lose their brilliance. They dim. And so this is why this is good news. I think Reeves talks about how to cultivate this, and it really involves contemplating the cross of Christ. It does involve the way we think and contemplate God, but it really is beyond the intellectual, and it should penetrate into our hearts in a way that deeply affects us. And I think that this is what enables us to face the brokenness and the misery and the tragedy of life. this awesome fear of God. Remember Machiavelli said that if you could, it'd be great to be loved and feared, but this is hard because they don't really meet in one person. In God, in the God we worship, fear and love meet. We love and we fear him. In the presence of that awesome majesty and that his redeeming love, we can feel safe. At the same time, we tremble, we quake, because he is so magnificent. And I think this is the missing piece in many people's lives from their faith. And I think it would be good for us to encourage this in our own hearts and in our circles that we travel. So thank you. That's what I have.
Come on up, Daniel.
Cool. Thank you. Oh, yeah. If that's okay, yeah.
There are two handhelds you can use, yeah. Go ahead. Then you won't have to, I can take that.
Try one more time.
Now am I on? Oh, okay. Yep. Okay, so I have a question. I'm wondering, as a parent, how do you know when the anxiety and fear your child is having is crossing a line where you can handle it or not, and you maybe should seek outward help? Kind of how do you know? And then my other part to that is, and this, I'm a kindergarten teacher, and I've actually heard this week from a parent, that they're somewhat scared to seek out counseling in this day and age for their child. And so how do you find a good Christian counselor for your child?
That's okay. I think my mic's still on. Yeah, so the first part was, how do you know if it's gone too far? Yeah, I'm not working with a lot of kids right now, but I work with families, and almost across the board, every family with children, every parent that I talk to, their children have experienced over the last year an elevated amount of anxiety. And so it's universal in my experience. And I think in light of the adjustments that children have had to make over the past year, it may not be a comfort, but this is almost like an expected response, that it is generated out of out of an understandable place, that children should not be asked to adjust and change in the drastic ways they've been asked to. And so the way they respond to it is only natural. What do you do about it? That's the hard question, right? And how do you seek help? How do you know when to seek help? It's difficult because I think there are fewer clinicians that specifically work with kids, depends on the age range. And it's even more tricky to find someone who's faith-based, right? Who's working with children, who's taking clients. This is a challenge, right? There's a huge need for this. There's a huge need for this. And it's not always that kids need professional help, but I understand wanting the support. But I think the first place to start before seeking professional help is in the community. There are parents who can help each other in this area, who can lean on each other. I think there's, within the body of Christ, there are resources, and this isn't necessarily professional counseling, but this is just strength in numbers, right? This is pooling our resources together and giving kids more connection points. A lot of the anxiety I'm seeing is because of isolation and drastic change. And I don't know how that could happen without the result that we're seeing, the anxiety and the pain and the suffering. The idea that that the kids should be able to go through what they've gone through and have no response, to me, is ridiculous. The challenge is, what do you do about it? I wish I had a good answer for how to locate that right person to have them work with. I think there are channels to try, but it's a challenge. So I'd be happy to talk to you after, but yeah, Daniel could probably say more.
Yay, it's on. I think I would lean back on that question of when is it a problem. I'll say a little bit more about that, like when help is necessary. One kind of rule of thumb is, what have you tried so far, and has it worked or not? Has it made it worse? Has it gotten better? A lot of people are much more anxious now, given the pandemic, than they were before, because it's something that's been recommended you be in isolation. And what, like that cycle of anxiety and avoidance I talked about, is when you have been less faced with social environments, crowds, speaking to other people in person, it's likely that some anxiety is going to develop. And so our next step is, if we get ahead of this pandemic, which I trust that we will eventually, is integrating back in with each other. And so I think the bar has been raised, probably, if you want to think about it that way, for what is considered clinical. In some ways, maybe all of us are experiencing anxiety. And the fact that we have a place like this protected where we can meet with each other and get in social situations, I actually think is really good for our anxiety, because then we're not as likely to become prone to be fearful of everybody and only see somebody as an infectious agent of a disease. So I think that one other rule of thumb is, like, so has anything worked? Another one would be, is it getting worse? Is it getting gradually worse? That's something you usually want to kind of jump on, right? Is the person becoming more withdrawn? Are they becoming more isolated? Are they, did they have a friend that they had once wanted to spend time with, but now it's like, no, I don't really, but you don't have specific identifiable reasons for that. That's a sign to me that anxiety is growing, and you might want to seek some counsel. And in terms of being fearful of seeking out help, my encouragement in that situation would be, just try to see if you can find somebody with some experience, because there's a number of reasons you might be nervous about seeing a counselor. Some parents oftentimes are, well, am I going to be judged as a bad parent, or is CPS going to be involved, and things like that. And that can be really intimidating, and it's helpful to have somebody who's wise and has done it for a while, because then they're less likely to panic themselves, and they're going to have already seen something like what you've gone through. So trying to find somebody who works with children or families is a specialty. I know of a practice in University Place I often refer people to, because that's what they specialize in. And they're integrated therapy services, and I could tell you more about them if you'd like. They have a clinical coordinator. And like Richard said, finding a community, like parental support groups, even just, mention it to a pastor and say, are there other people that are talking about this? Most likely it's yes. And if you're courageous enough, would you be willing to help me connect, us to each other? And then maybe it starts with just 2 or 3 parents, and then it might snowball into something bigger, just to have you be able to consult with people and support. Is there anybody you know? Is there a good Christian counselor? Is there somebody who works with kids? Is there a pediatrician even that might be able to talk to me about this? So I hope that gives a little bit more words to that dilemma.
Two questions, actually. And the first one probably has been addressed, like you've just been talking. The past year has been very difficult for many, many people. Can you speak, the first one is, talk about a little bit about the losses that a lot of people have faced. There's human loss that's devastating, but the loss of, especially people that are college age, that maybe didn't get to graduate officially, and compounded losses that have happened all year. And I think it's caused grief and anger as well. And to speak to that. And then the other question is, or comment, can you speak on the stigma that surrounds depression and anxiety and fear, and how we can lessen that stigma so that it's not looked down upon if people want to talk about those things. And it's still difficult. So if you could talk about those, appreciate it.
Yeah, the first one about loss. And there's a lot of loss going on. I think clinically, what we're able to do sometimes is to witness and honor loss, where it's not really honored on a societal level. It's sort of just swept under the rug. So I think, what can you do with loss except, bravely suffer it and honor what is lost? I mean, there's not always something you can do to avoid the loss. But I mean, what we would want to do, I think, is help people to honor the pain of the loss, to find what is good about, if something is lost and it's painful, it meant it was good. So I mean, take the good that you can from that. A lot of times it can lead to kind of a deepening of appreciation for the value of things. So there are some good that can come of it, but I think if you think about a funeral or a memorial service, it's really honoring loss. And there are no rituals to honor the loss of a lot of what's being lost. So clinically, I just try to help give space for that and give it the attention it deserves. And I'll think about the other question.
Yeah, I'll speak to the stigma one and then maybe circle back to the first question a little bit. But absolutely, there's still stigma. It's less than it used to be, I would say, for seeking out help for depression and anxiety. But it's still there, and maybe it's like levels of stigma, you might say, where somebody might feel comfortable, going to therapy for some issue, but not others. I think the hardest part about seeking out help is scheduling the first appointment, honestly. One, because if you're doing it, it take like 3 or 4 months to see that person, at least with me. But if the other thing is that it's just so terrifying to like admit that to yourself, that you need to seek that out and you want that, and then to have to wait for it. I've heard time and time again people who have said that they started feeling better once they had scheduled the appointment. And that's always reassuring, right? Just the idea that, okay, I can get help and I can sort of, put that behind me, because there's that anticipation fear of what's going to happen when I actually get there. So just showing up is a big deal, and beginning to speak. But most people, when they come to my office, they are so ready to let it all out by the time they get there, that I just am time and time again reminded of the need to have other people to share your story with, and what's going on for you, and why you're feeling what you're feeling. There's probably a story there for everybody who has a stigma. It's probably, I would imagine, your household. It wasn't encouraged growing up. Ironically, it was kind of seen as the stigmatized thing in my household. And maybe that's part of the reason why I became a psychologist myself, is because I was really curious and I wanted to know more. And I did premarital counseling with my wife, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. Maybe I could do this. And that's what I ended up doing. So it is okay to seek out help. And I want to encourage people that my goal is to give people hope in people again. I want to give people hope that people can help. Because usually the people who have the biggest stigma or the biggest avoidance of seeking out help are the people who've been hurt and wounded the most. Right? You've told many people about what you're suffering with and what you're struggling with, and people didn't get it, and they didn't understand, and they didn't know how to comfort you. And those are the people I want to see, because I want to give them a new experience of what a person can be like, how they can listen, how they can comfort and care.
Yeah, I do notice a slight shift in the culture's level of stigma, and you see a little bit more normalizing of seeking out help and that not being such a stain and a mark against you. I think the church is sort of like following behind, but I think events like this are a very good thing, because we're talking openly about anxiety. We're talking openly about things that affect depression in a non-condemning way. And I think this cultivates kind of a compassion and sort of an empathy for these issues, which they're real whether we pay attention to them or not. So why not embrace each other with compassion and allow for conversations about this? Oh, there we go.
Oh, there it is. Okay. So early on in one of your early slides, you had a list of 4 things. So there was anatomy, physiology, sociology, psychology. And I'm just kind of curious, when you're looking at fear and anxiety and panic attacks and all, how do you go about, and then there was a question about medications also, how do you go about differential diagnosis as to what percentage of a person has a different, in one of these categories, whether it's physiology or pathophysiology or strictly psychology or demon possession, principalities and powers? How do you go about differentiating and saying you're better off somewhere else or doing something, co-treatment or something like that?
Yeah, my first line of treatment is exorcism, and then I move to the other. Sorry, that was too low-hanging fruit. So I personally, I didn't say this as I was presenting those things, but I see them as all integrated. And you might have kind of heard that in my tone. I was saying some people say it's all biology. Some people say it's all psychology. Some people say it's all sociology. Some people say it's all spiritual. And I think it's all intertwined. And so the way I think of it is I try to think of how do I fit into all the systems you already have in place, rather than how do I convert you to psychology as the cure to anxiety. That's not my goal. My goal is to understand, what's your faith? What are your relationships like? How do you feel about the systems in which you live? And what's going on biologically for you? Like, what are the symptoms and how much of them are, biologically related versus your thinking, versus how you're behaving, versus the people which you're surrounded by. And so most people, it's pretty obvious when they come in and talk to me at the beginning, right? It's their marriage is terrible, or it's that they can't calm their body down, or they can't sleep, that they just can't calm their mind down. They can't change what they're thinking. They just constantly are criticizing themselves, or they're constantly seeing the worst in situations. And then the spiritual isn't usually what people come to me to talk about right away, but I find that almost always it's intertwined, whether it's the fear of existence and death, whether it's I haven't been to church in so long, and that's why I'm talking to you instead of a pastor, and I had a bad falling out with the church because of how they handled this issue. And so people open up all of those different layers. And so I don't think of it as there's percentages of each. I think they're all intertwined. Does that answer that question a little bit? I would say for anxiety, if I was to take a guess, my bias is psychology and sociology are the two most important, meaning the relationships you're in and the ways in which you've been taught to appraise or evaluate situations. And I think, in my opinion, the body follows that. But I do think that sometimes your bodily response gets overlearned. Like, there's two examples. I would say panic attacks and generalized anxiety, where you just can't stop worrying. Those are ones where it's a little bit trickier to just have, thinking and action, right? Because what do you do with a fear that's constantly changing? So we talked about that fear this time. Now it's this one, now it's this one, now it's this one, right? That's a little bit trickier to overcome, and usually medicine's involved. And then panic attacks, they come sudden and unexpected, and I can't calm them down. Sometimes medication's involved in that too. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, just a quick thought, because that was a great answer. There is a process of elimination that you can ask a lot of questions to try and determine what to focus on. But if you just ask someone what's the problem, they'll have an idea of what they think the source of it is. But in my field, family therapy, there were some clinicians who started to see that they would take someone into this clinical environment, treat them, and they would be doing better, but then they would send them back into their environment where their family and their system would go back to the old problem again. And so we really try to address, systemically, like the systems that the person exists in, their family, their marriage, their church, their workplace, because these are all part of the functions of how they experience life. And so my bias is toward that kind of relational aspect of people, but I want to ask people how they're thinking and how that affects how they're experiencing fear. But I never ignore the relational component. But I think I agree, they're all intertwined. So there's a temptation to want to reduce a problem down to one simple explanation, and it's rarely that.
Thank you. I knew we weren't going to get to all of our questions, but we really didn't get to all of our questions or comprehensive help. But we do have some gifts for a few fortunate people. So Margie is going to, you can come and do it.
Face your fears, Margie.
Yeah, face your fear.
I just wanted to mention the list that, well, there was a list of books up there, and we will get that reproduced and put it on the RPC Life. And this evening, we do have 4 books, 2 of which were mentioned this evening, and they are gifts for 4 people. So if you check under your seats, and you have a sticker that says, "I'm a winner," then you will get a book.
Didn't get it. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, I will give those to you in just a minute. And so we are going to finish off with the song on the other side of your sheet. And we also just want to give a round of applause to Daniel and Richard for their time here this evening. Thank you.
Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and he was raised.
till I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, I hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to Him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me.
Hey, Tim, here we go. I'm going to send you out. Well, you don't have to leave right away, but I'm going to send you out with a blessing. It's the benediction from number 6 that we heard this morning. Well, not in Hebrew. Yeah, English. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little rusty on the Hebrew. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance, his demeanor, his face upon you, and give you his peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers and to the wisdoms and the kings and others who set up. Thank you.